What would you do for the sake of science? Would you harm another living being, or even yourself? In this video, we will show you some of the most shocking experiments in history and the people who performed them. These are the disturbing figures who had no regard for human rights, dignity, or life. Brace yourselves for a chilling journey into the depths of madness. But before we start, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our spine-chilling content. Let's get started. 8. Dr. Josef Mengele. First up, we have Dr. Josef Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death. This Nazi doctor conducted gruesome experiments on prisoners during World War II, especially on twins, dwarfs, and people with physical abnormalities. He was fascinated by genetics and eugenics, and wanted to create a superior race of Aryans. Some of his experiments included injecting chemicals into people's eyes, sewing twins together, and removing organs without anesthesia. Many of his victims died or were permanently disabled by his experiments. He escaped to South America after the war and was never brought to justice. 7. Dr. Karl Clauberg. Speaking of Nazis, another figure who performed horrific experiments was Dr. Karl Clauberg. He was a gynecologist who specialized in forced sterilization. He performed his experiments on thousands of women in Auschwitz, the notorious concentration camp. He injected various substances into their uteruses, such as formaldehyde, acid, and air, to block their fallopian tubes. He also exposed them to X-rays and other methods to damage their reproductive organs. Many of his subjects died from infections, bleeding, and shock, while others were left infertile and traumatized. 6. The Unit 731. Moving on to another country that was involved in World War II, we have Unit 731, the Japanese Human Experimentation Camp. This covert unit of the Japanese Army conducted horrifying experiments on prisoners, mostly Chinese, Korean, and Russian. They wanted to develop biological and chemical weapons and test the limits of the human body. Some of their experiments included vivisection, which is cutting open people while they are still alive, biological warfare, which involved infecting people with deadly diseases like plague and anthrax, and freezing experiments, which involved exposing people to extreme cold and frostbite. The unit was responsible for killing tens of thousands of people and spreading diseases across China. 5. Dr. Walter Freeman. Another example of a figure who experimented on humans in the name of science was Dr. Walter Freeman, the lobotomist. Freeman popularized the lobotomy procedure, which involved inserting a metal rod into the brain through the eye socket and moving it back and forth to sever the connections between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain. He claimed that this would cure mental illnesses, such as schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety. He performed thousands of surgeries, often without proper anesthesia, sterilization, or consent. Many of his patients were left permanently damaged and mentally impaired, while some died from complications. One of his most famous patients was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy, who was lobotomized at the age of 23 and spent the rest of her life in an institution. 4. Dr. Robert Heath. Another figure who experimented on the brain was Dr. Robert Heath, the mind control enthusiast. Heath was a psychiatrist who conducted unethical experiments involving electroshock therapy and implanting electrodes into patients' brains to manipulate their behavior. He wanted to find the pleasure center of the brain and stimulate it to treat various disorders such as schizophrenia, depression, and homosexuality. He also experimented with drugs, such as LSD, to alter the mental state of his subjects. One of his most controversial experiments involved giving a gay man LSD and forcing him to have sex with a female prostitute while stimulating his brain with electrodes. He claimed that this cured the man's homosexuality, but the man later committed suicide. 3. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Another figure who experimented with drugs was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the mastermind of MK-Ultra. This was the CIA's secret mind control program, which ran from the 1950s to the 1970s. Gottlieb oversaw experiments involving LSD, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture. He wanted to find ways to control, manipulate, and interrogate people, and to create assassins, spies, and super soldiers. He tested his methods on unsuspecting subjects, such as prisoners, soldiers, students, and even CIA agents. Some of his experiments resulted in death, injury, and mental breakdown. One of his most notorious victims was Frank Olson, a CIA scientist who was dosed with LSD without his knowledge, and later fell to his death from a hotel window. 2. Dr. Henry Cotton, another figure who experimented on unsuspecting subjects, was Dr. Henry Cotton, the dental surgeon turned mad scientist. Cotton was the director of the New Jersey State Hospital for the Insane, and he believed that mental illnesses were caused by infections. He thought that by removing the source of the infection, he could cure the patients. He started by removing their teeth, then moved on to their tonsils, and eventually their organs, such as the stomach, spleen, colon, and uterus. He performed hundreds of surgeries, often without anesthesia or consent, and claimed that he had a high success rate. However, many of his patients died from infections, bleeding, and shock, while others were left mutilated and disabled. 1. Dr. Harry Harlow. The last figure on our list is Dr. Harry Harlow, the monkey torturer. Harlow was a psychologist who studied the effects of maternal deprivation and social isolation on monkeys. He wanted to understand the nature of love and attachment and how they affect development and behavior. He conducted infamous experiments that involved separating baby monkeys from their mothers and subjecting them to extreme isolation and psychological torment. He created devices such as the Pit of Despair, which was a metal chamber that isolated the monkey for months or years, and the Rape Rack, which was a device that forced female monkeys to mate with aggressive males. He also created surrogate mothers made of wire or cloth and observed how the monkeys preferred the ones that provided comfort over the ones that provided food. He concluded that love was essential for healthy development, but his experiments caused irreversible damage and suffering to his subjects. We would love to hear your thoughts on these shocking experiments and the people who performed them. Do you think they were justified by science, or were they just mad and evil? How would you react if you were in the same situation as their subjects? What would you do to prevent such atrocities from happening again? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious.